Hey guys, today we're going on a fascinating journey through the centuries to a time when prohibition walked hand in hand with pleasure, when religion set the rules, but people still found ways to break them. What was sex really like in the Middle Ages? What were the desires, taboos, and secret practices of that era? Ready to bust some myths and face the truth? Then buckle up. It's going to be interesting, unexpected, and very revealing.
In the Middle Ages, the body was the enemy, and the flesh a test. The world, immersed in prayers, fear of hell, and rigid dogmas, remained human nonetheless. With all its desires, weaknesses, and passions. Sex, in that era, was not seen as something natural, but rather as something suspicious. It wasn't entirely rejected. It was feared, controlled, subdued. The human body was a battlefield between heaven and earth. The dominant ideology of the Middle Ages was Christian, which meant theology played the central role in shaping views on what was permissible and what was sinful. Church fathers such as St. Augustine asserted that sexual desire only emerged after the fall. Before Eve gave Adam the fruit, man and woman lived in purity and harmony. Their bodies knew no lust. After the fall, the flesh rebelled against the spirit, and any desire became a symbol of lack of control and sin. Sexual intercourse, even within marriage, was regarded as a necessary evil, permitted only for the purpose of procreation. In reality, medieval people, like all people, remained physical beings. Their desires didn't disappear despite the prohibitions, but every step toward passion was accompanied by anxiety. How many days of penance would be required for this sin? Priests asked direct questions during confession. How many times? On which days? For what purpose? There were special penitential manuals that guided the priest. Sex during Lent, 40 days of penance. Relations with someone other than one's wife, excommunication. Oral or anal sex, years of penance or exile. Married life was also under strict control. The church dictated on which days spouses were allowed to have intercourse. During fasts, before holidays, on holy days, forbidden. Also forbidden during menstruation, pregnancy, and shortly after childbirth. In practice, this meant that intimate life was restricted for more than half the year. And yet, despite these prohibitions, people found ways to be together. Sometimes they sinned and repented, sometimes they hid, sometimes they simply ignored the rules. In villages, where priests visited rarely, morals were more relaxed. In cities, stricter. Inside monasteries, where thousands of men and women went to save their souls, the flesh still lived. Monks tormented themselves, slept on bare stone, wore sackcloth, whipped themselves to quell desire. Some monasteries did maintain strict discipline. But in others, monks kept concubines, nuns had children, and sometimes female sexuality was considered especially dangerous. Sermons portrayed women as gateways to sin. Eve became the symbol of betrayal and temptation. Even beauty was seen as a potential trap. Long hair, an uncovered face, a singing voice, all of it could lead a man into temptation. A woman was thus expected to hide beneath a veil, in modest clothing, in the shadows. Church courts were especially harsh toward women. Premarital relations could ruin a woman's life forever. She would be branded a harlot, lose the right to marry, to be respected, even to receive a Christian burial. Prostitution, despite being condemned, did not disappear. In fact, many cities had official brothels. Authorities and the church often turned a blind eye, believing it was better to give men access to the sinful but controlled than risk rape and seduction of respectable women. Prostitutes paid taxes and sometimes even brought income to monasteries. They were forced to wear special clothing, bright belts, caps, badges, to not be confused with honest women. They were buried separately, on the outskirts, without a cross. Even romantic love was viewed with suspicion. Passionate love was considered irrational. The church encouraged arranged marriages without feelings, especially among noble families. Young men and women could be wed without ever having seen each other before. Marital duty was carried out in silence, under supervision, sometimes even with a witness present to ensure the union was valid. Everything intimate was political. Nevertheless, folk culture retained festivals related to fertility. In some regions, spring rituals were held in which young people spent the night in the fields. The church tried to ban such customs, but they survived. Sometimes peasant women turned to wise women to attract a man, using herbs, amulets, spells. Men believed that intercourse with a virgin could cure illness. Medicine and sex were often intertwined in folk beliefs. Behind the stone walls of monasteries, among the sound of bells and Latin prayers, lay not only asceticism, but also an inner struggle with bodily desires. The medieval monastery was, on the one hand, a place of solitude, silence, and spiritual refinement. On the other, a place where a person, cut off from the outside world, was left alone with themselves, their thoughts, and their body, which, despite fasting, cold, and hours of prayer, continued to remind them of its presence. The church proclaimed monastic life as the highest form of existence, a renunciation of the world for the sake of God. The vow of chastity was meant to sever the monk or nun from all carnal desires. But in reality, the flesh didn't disappear. It merely hid, was locked away, suppressed, and at times burst forth with doubled strength. Young novices, often barely past puberty, entered monasteries at their parents' will. Not all made this choice consciously. Some families gave children to the cloister for economic reasons. Fewer heirs meant more land for the rest. Others sent them to save the soul of the family line. Within the monastery walls, the adolescent began to experience not only God, but also strange feelings, attraction, shame, dreams that embarrassed them. Teachers and spiritual mentors gave advice, mostly in the form of prohibitions. They recommended cold baths, strict fasting, tireless labor, all to subdue the flesh. But it wasn't enough. Secret affairs regularly took place in monasteries between monks and nuns, servants and novices. There were even cases of monks using hidden passages to visit women's monasteries at night. Monastic walls became merely external symbols of isolation. Inside, people still bore the same passions as those in the secular world. Historical documents preserve numerous accounts of such violations. In 1274, the Church Council in Lyon complained that some monks live more dissolute lives than the youths in towns. In England, monasteries were found where women of unknown origin lived in the cellars, nursing infants. In parts of Italy and France, officials conducted investigations, found children born in monasteries and issued sentences. But more often, punishments remained internal: transfers, penance, isolation. Authorities feared public scandal. The situation was especially difficult in women's monasteries. Nuns were taught to be brides of Christ, wore wedding rings, and renounced men. But these monasteries were often remote, surrounded by forests with minimal protection. Riders, peasants, even priests could enter. Relationships between nuns were also recorded. In the 14th century, a Dominican monk from Germany, Hellwig, wrote in a treatise that the devil tempts women in convents to sinful love for one another, and proposed stricter inspection of nighttime cells. Some monasteries introduced round-the-clock surveillance, banned nuns from speaking for more than 5 minutes at a time, and monitored their gazes. This bred an atmosphere of mistrust, fear, and suppression. Masturbation in monasteries was considered a particularly grave sin. It was called the sin of solitude, a manifestation of pride and weakness. In confession manuals, monks were asked, "Did you touch yourself at night? Did you see lustful images in your dreams?" Such acts warranted 40 days of fasting, a ban on communion, and social isolation. Some monks informed on each other. Others hid their behavior. Sometimes the guilt became unbearable, but there were alternative approaches. Some theologians, like Thomas Aquinas, tried to view sexuality as part of human nature. He acknowledged that desire doesn't vanish with a vow and suggested combating it not with fear, but with redirection through prayer, labor, and spiritual discipline. However, such ideas did not gain wide acceptance. The Church continued to rely on fear and punishment as its primary tools of control. By the late Middle Ages, many monasteries had lost their original rigor. They became homes for the nobility, widows, and younger children of wealthy families. These places turned into centers of local power and luxury, with embroidery, music, receptions, and guests. Love letters, secret meetings, even orgies. Some monasteries in Germany and Burgundy were exposed for widespread affairs between monks and nuns. In one case, 12 pregnant women were discovered, one of whom gave birth to triplets. The Church fought this with mixed success. Popes issued bulls, reformers called for a return to the rule. New orders emerged to renew monastic discipline. The Cistercians, Carthusians, Franciscans. They once again preached poverty, silence, fasting, and seclusion. But even among them, there were failures. Interestingly, many monks and nuns recorded their emotions in diaries. Some manuscripts have survived. In them, a real internal battle. A 17th century monk wrote, "When I touch the floor with cold fingers during night prayer, my body trembles, not from fear, but from desire. Lord, do not let me fall." A 15th century nun from northern Italy wrote in a letter, "I have not slept for 3 nights thinking about..." In medieval cities, prostitution was not merely a hidden phenomenon. It became part of the urban structure, like markets, churches, or town halls. Despite constant condemnation from church pulpits, women, and sometimes men, who sold their bodies played a special, contradictory role in the streets, alleys, and even districts designated by authorities. Prostitution existed on the border between sin and necessity, between public shame and society's silent consent. European cities, especially port and trading hubs like London, Paris, Barcelona, Hamburg, or Venice, saw a steady influx of solitary men, merchants, craftsmen, soldiers. These men, deprived of families and stable partners, were viewed as a potential threat to public order. Cities sought ways to control their passions. In this context, prostitution was seen as a lesser evil. Better to direct desires toward a fallen woman than to risk rape, the seduction of other men's wives, or unnatural sins. In many cities, official brothels emerged, recognized and regulated by the municipality. They were often guarded and sometimes even patronized by city authorities. For example, in 13th century Toulouse, brothels were under city council control, and the madam paid taxes like butchers or shoemakers. Prostitutes were required to undergo regular medical inspections, primitive in method but still conducted, and to wear distinctive clothing, often yellow belts or special headdresses. These marked them as impure, but also allowed the authorities to identify them. Nevertheless, despite this official status, a prostitute's life remained harsh and unpredictable. Many women entered the trade not by choice. War, famine, orphanhood, rape, fleeing rural areas, or being disowned by a father all pushed women onto the streets. Some were sold into brothels by parents or guardians. In large cities, there were designated inspectors who assessed new girls, checking their suitability, age, and health. A prostitute's workday was grueling. In brothels, women could see 10 to 15 clients a day. Living conditions were unsanitary and dangerous. Diseases spread quickly: syphilis, gonorrhea, ulcers, scabies. Medical care was nearly non-existent. The church viewed illness as punishment for sin. Only a few monks attempted to help, usually in secret, out of compassion. The mental state of these women was of little interest to contemporaries. Prostitutes were seen as sinful creatures, meant to satisfy desire while serving as a reminder of humanity's fall. But this image was hypocritical. The same priests who denounced lust from the pulpit would hire girls at night. Some monks and even bishops kept secret mistresses. There are records of brothels run by former nuns expelled from convents for fornication.
Sometimes women returned to normal life. Former prostitutes became cooks, wet nurses, or servants. But the stigma haunted them for life. Even if they married, their past could be used to blackmail or disgrace them. Interestingly, the folk image of the prostitute wasn't always negative. In ballads and tales, she might be portrayed as a woman with a heart, ready to help a traveler, feed the poor, offer shelter. Sometimes she appeared wiser and kinder than the wives of wealthy citizens. This folk image endured as a reminder that sin is not always evil and virtue is not always owned by the church. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, especially with the arrival of the Renaissance, attitudes toward sexuality began to shift. Prostitution was no longer seen as an inevitable evil, but became the subject of regulation. Doctors began to study sexually transmitted diseases. Cities established special shelters, but progress was slow. Most women remained powerless, dependent on the mercy of clients, guards, or brothel keepers. Sexual life in medieval cities wasn't a hidden passion behind closed doors. It was a public necessity, woven into the fabric of economy, power, and religion. The prostitute in the Middle Ages was a tragic and resilient figure. Her body was a commodity, her name forgotten, but her presence was indispensable. She was a shadow in the streets, a voice in the night, a reminder that humanity is made of more than just spirit. Unlike towns, medieval villages had no brothels, no official oversight, and no formal houses for the satisfaction of passions. But this didn't mean sexual life was absent. It simply took a different form, quiet, tightly controlled by the community, wrapped in superstition, fear, and folk ideas of good, evil, honor, and shame. A peasant's life revolved around land, labor, and the church calendar. Fieldwork, harvests, dues, and holidays dictated the rhythm of existence. In this harsh and limited environment, intimacy was inseparable from marriage
inheritance, and family continuity. Sex was not seen as pleasure, but as a means of producing children, sustaining the household, and sealing agreements between families. Yet beneath this crude exterior lay a vivid, complex picture of human emotion, passion, and tragedy. Village girls often engaged in sexual relations before marriage. This was not encouraged, but it wasn't rare. In parts of France, Germany, and the British Isles, a tradition called trial cohabitation existed. Bride and groom lived together before marriage to see if the woman could conceive. If she became pregnant, the union was formalized. If not, the engagement could be broken. The church opposed this practice, but people stood firm. A barren marriage was a disgrace. Intimacy was deeply tied to public scrutiny. Everyone knew everything. Houses were tiny, beds were shared. Children saw their parents sleep together. Young people knew who was visiting whom at night. Older women kept watch over girls. Boys boasted to each other. Sexual relations often began early, at 13 or 14, especially among orphans or the poor. Premarital pregnancies were common. Some families later legitimized the child through marriage. Others refused, and the girl was cast out. Getting pregnant outside marriage could be a tragedy. A single mother lost her chance of marrying, became an outcast, and her child was labeled a bastard and shame of the family. Such women either left the village, hid in monasteries, or endured mockery, sometimes even beatings. Occasionally, a girl was forced to publicly repent in church before the whole village. In rare cases, mob justice occurred. But there were exceptions. Relatives might forgive. A man might agree to marry, especially if the child was clearly his. Masturbation, homosexual relations, and even bestiality existed in villages, though never discussed openly. Anything deviant was seen as the devil's work. Boys were scared with stories of hellfire for fornication, girls with womb drying up. But in reality, especially in rites and folk beliefs around childbirth, were widespread. It was believed a woman should conceive under a full moon, after eating certain foods, or performing a ritual. Some thought that if a man didn't pray before intercourse, the child would be weak or deformed. The sex of the child was believed to depend on position or season. To conceive a boy, a woman was advised to eat meat and drink wine. For a girl, bread and water. If a woman gave birth to many daughters, she might be accused of weak flesh or sinful blood. The sexual act itself lacked romance. It was quiet, quick, under a blanket. Love wasn't discussed. Tenderness wasn't expected. Sex was often seen as the husband's duty and the wife's obligation. A husband could force his wife, and it wasn't considered rape. Sometimes women complained to the priest if the husband demanded sex too often, especially during Lent or illness. The church imposed strict limits: no sex during Lent, on holy days, or Sundays. Violations required confession and sometimes public penance. Yet love did exist in villages. Young people wrote each other simple letters, gave small gifts, secretly met in meadows, near wells, in barns. Boys climbed through girls' windows at night. Sometimes girls ran away with a lover, leaving their families. These stories ended happily at times, or in tragedy. Some couples stayed together for life, despite poverty, gossip, or illness. Infidelity existed, but was kept secret. A woman caught in adultery risked her life. Men, less so, but still faced punishment, especially if the mistress was another man's wife. Sometimes a fine settled the matter, more often beatings or banishment. Records from village courts tell of husbands presenting witnesses who saw my wife lying under another man, demanding hair-cutting and shame in the village square. Sexual violence, sadly, was not uncommon. Girls were assaulted by drunk peasants, soldiers, or laborers. Some cases were brought before village assemblies, others were hushed up. If the rapist was wealthy, he paid his way out. If poor, he could be killed. Victims rarely received protection. Rape was seen as a private matter, a disgrace not just for the woman, but for her whole family. Marriage did not guarantee happiness. Often marriages were arranged. Fathers gave away daughters in exchange for help, land, or a cow. Husbands could be old, cruel, or sick. Wives, oppressed and frightened. Yet some couples shared work, loved their children, and supported one another. Sex in such families was rare. Fatigue, poverty, illness got in the way. But when it happened, it wasn't always mechanical. Intimacy could become the only solace in a hard life. The medieval village lived through the body, yet was ashamed of it. Sex was surrounded by silence. Unlike peasants, for whom sex was primarily a biological and economic necessity, among the nobility and knights, physicality took on a different, almost theatrical meaning. It was rooted in power, inheritance, family honor, and political alliances. And yet, it was in the chivalric milieu that one of the most influential concepts of the Middle Ages emerged: courtly love. A blend of platonic ideal and secret desire, around which songs, romances, rituals, and even daily etiquette were built. Marriage among the nobility was a matter of benefit. There was no love, only calculation. Parents arranged everything in advance, often before the children were even born. A noble youth could be betrothed to a girl of 7. Marriage would be formalized upon reaching maturity, sometimes earlier, but the decision was made without the involvement of the young couple. The woman became the husband's property. She brought a dowry, land, castles, titles, and was expected to bear heirs. If no children were born, the woman was often blamed for infertility, since a man rarely admitted his own impotence. Intimacy in such unions was rare, cold, but obligatory. Nevertheless, it was precisely in the aristocratic sphere that the idea of sexual passion as an art form emerged. Courtly love, an idealized feeling of a knight for a lady, was not meant to be physically fulfilled. It was love outside of marriage, but not necessarily involving cohabitation. Men admired ladies, served them, wrote poems, and dedicated tournament victories to them. The woman, usually married, accepted these tokens of attention and could respond kindly or reject them. Often the relationships remained platonic, but beneath them hid genuine passion and, not infrequently, sexual affairs. These relationships were not public, but they were no secret either. Everyone knew that a knight could be faithful to his lady of the heart, even if she was another man's wife. What mattered was the form. Secret letters, subtle glances, gestures. A romantic connection between a knight and a lady could last for years, and as long as the husband stayed silent, it was considered permissible. Open adultery could lead to a duel, but more often it was concealed. A lady caught in a moment of weakness only lost her reputation if a scandal broke out. At the same time, men, especially those of high status, led quite active, intimate lives. It was acceptable to have mistresses, concubines, and often children born out of wedlock. Kings and dukes openly kept favorites. For example, Louis IX had illegitimate children, yet the church forgave him. Charlemagne lived with several women simultaneously. The sexuality of noble women was dual. On one hand, the ideal of the Virgin Mary demanded chastity, obedience, and motherhood. On the other, court ladies enjoyed greater freedom, especially widows or wives of wealthy but weak men. They hosted salons, flirted, wrote love letters, and met knights in secret. Some learned the art of seduction from older friends. The greatest threat remained pregnancy. An illegitimate child could be a catastrophe. Therefore, women resorted to extreme measures, from herbal infusions to abortion, despite strict church prohibitions. Contraceptives were known and used, though rarely effective. Vaginal sponges soaked in herbs, herbal teas, especially wormwood, tansy, rue, postcoital delay, and lunar rituals were employed. Aristocratic women often turned to wise women or herbalists, which sometimes led to death from poisoning or infection. Yet knowledge about the body and ways to influence it did exist and was passed down among women, especially in closed environments such as courts and convents. Violence against women, including noble women, also existed. Despite their status, a woman without protection could become a victim. At the same time, laws protected the honor of a noble lady far more than that of a peasant woman. Attempted rape of a noble woman could be punishable by death, especially if it involved someone's wife or daughter from an influential family. Often such matters were settled within the family, with revenge carried out without trial, by blood. Royal courts were a world of their own. Sexuality there intertwined with intrigue, politics, and diplomacy. A woman's influence at court often depended not only on her lineage, but also on whom she could attract. Royal mistresses could rule entire states. Marguerite of Navarre, Agnes Sorel, Diane de Poitiers. They were more than lovers. They became centers of power, though only for as long as they held the monarch's favor. Love among the nobility was not impossible, but it had to make its way through rituals, intrigues, vows, and family contracts. Sometimes, spouses truly loved one another. In such unions, intimacy could be rich and consistent, but more often, passion bloomed outside of marriage, in gardens, hunting lodges, balls and tournaments, monasteries where noble widows were temporarily sent, even in secluded castle towers. Knights, especially young pages and squires, were described as being full of burning desire, both for women and for each other. Homosexual relationships in knightly circles were officially condemned, yet they existed. In some cases, they became true unions, where an older knight acted as patron to his young companion. Chronicles mention intimate sexual life in medieval cities, from prostitution to public baths. With the arrival of the 11th century, European cities began to grow. Artisans, merchants, wandering journeymen, students, pilgrims, soldiers, and vagabonds flocked to them. These places were not only centers of labor and trade, but also hubs of bodily freedom, something the Church, despite its efforts, could never fully control. In the urban environment, sexuality manifested differently than in the countryside or at court. Here, carnal life became more open, and its forms more varied. Its most prominent expression was prostitution, an inseparable part of the medieval city. Prostitution was considered a sin, but a necessary evil. The Church, while declaring transactional love a crime against morality, tolerated its existence in order to satisfy uncontrollable men and prevent them from seducing wives, widows, and maidens. Many city authorities, especially in France, Germany, and Italy, kept records of brothels, regulated their operations, imposed taxes, and even protected prostitutes from violence. From the 12th to the 15th centuries, brothels became an important part of the urban landscape. They were usually located away from main streets in dirty districts, near city walls, rivers, ports, or markets. These places had various names: bordel, stew, Frauenhaus, maison close. Some cities even had entire streets where every door led to a house of pleasure. In Avignon, for instance, church authorities operated brothels near the papal palace. In London, Southwark was officially recognized as an entertainment district. Women working in brothels were called women of joy, street girls, or simply streetwalkers. They were divided into those who worked indoors, for a fee set by the owner, and those who stood outside, soliciting clients and sometimes serving them right in alleyways. Some worked independently, renting rooms from widows or craftsmen. Others were under the control of matrons, women who owned the brothel and took a cut from every transaction. Prostitutes were easily recognizable by their appearance. In some cities, they were required to wear specific clothing. In Paris, yellow belts or head coverings. In Naples, wide red dresses. In Lubeck, patches shaped like tongues of flame. These markers helped honest women distinguish themselves from sinners, even from a distance. In Venice, there were even wooden balconies from which courtesans called out to clients. Most prostitutes were poor. They ended up in brothels due to poverty, loss of family, rape, or orphanhood. Some city authorities tried to make their lives more orderly. In Nuremberg, for example, women were examined twice a week by doctors for sores or discharge. In Bordeaux, brothels were closed during Lent and religious holidays. In some places, women were taught to dance, speak well, and even write, especially if they served merchants or students. Hospitals and houses of repentance were established for prostitutes, where they were sent in old age or illness. However, life on the streets remained dangerous. Women could be beaten, raped with impunity, or used as scapegoats during epidemics. Their bodies were considered unclean, even though they bathed more often than most city dwellers. Only a few lucky courtesans rose above, becoming mistresses of noblemen, receiving jewels, homes, and finery. Such women were respected and sometimes even invited into salons. In Venice, they were called cortesiane oneste, honest courtesans. Men who frequented brothels came from all walks of life, from students and servants to priests, craftsmen, and merchants. Visiting prostitutes was seen as a kind of initiation rite for young men. In some guilds, an apprentice was expected to visit a woman before taking his final exam. Young men were even escorted to brothels by elders. This was not condemned. The church remained silent, and the guilds looked the other way. A sin, but an acceptable one. Clergymen were no exception. Though monks and clerics vowed chastity, they often broke it. Chronicles mention priests caught in brothels, and even entire religious brotherhoods keeping mistresses. Some monasteries maintained their own comfort houses, allegedly for a spiritual control over passion, especially during pilgrimages. One of the key elements of urban sexuality was the public bathhouse. Initially designed for hygiene, they quickly became places of meeting, flirting, and sex. In Germany, these establishments were called Badstube, in England, stew. People bathed, ate, played dice, drank wine, and engaged in intimacy. Baths often featured paired rooms, dark cabins, and massage areas. Young women and men worked there, frequently offering additional services. Authorities tried to restrict debauchery in the bathhouses. Decrees were issued banning mixed bathing or requiring patrons to wear towels. Some cities shut down bathhouses during epidemics, especially after the Black Death, 1347 to 1351, which was linked to sins of the flesh. But people kept going. The baths were the last refuge of physicality in a world where the church preached shame for every touch. Both ecclesiastical and secular powers weighed the body, virginity, and hygiene in the Middle Ages between honor, fear, and sin. In the medieval worldview, the body was not merely a physical shell. It was seen as the vessel of the soul, an instrument of sin, and simultaneously an object of social and spiritual scrutiny. Particular attention was paid to sexual characteristics, virginity, bodily cleanliness, and symbolic inviolability, especially in women. In this context, sexuality was not a matter of personal choice, but a duty to one's family, the church, and society. Virginity and a woman's honor. Virginity was the most valuable asset of a young girl, especially among noble and wealthy classes. Its physical proof, the presence of the hymen, was considered evidence of the family's honor, a guarantee of bloodline purity, and a mark of virtue. Losing virginity before marriage could bring shame not only to the girl but also to her father, brothers, and even neighbors. Thus, girls were raised in strict environments from an early age. They were isolated from male gazes, dressed in heavy garments, and forbidden to go outside without supervision. Mothers instilled fear of men in their daughters and taught them to avoid unnecessary glances and not to speak to men without a reason. Often, girls knew nothing about sexual relations before their wedding night. In high society, tests of virginity were practiced. For example, on the eve of a wedding, a healer or wise woman might be invited to examine the bride's body using her fingers or herbal infusions. Sometimes, after the wedding night, blood-stained sheets were displayed as proof of chastity. In some parts of Europe, it was customary to show them to the entire village. If there was no blood, scandal could erupt, and the marriage might be declared invalid. But nature did not always conform to society's expectations. There were cases where even true virgins did not bleed. Then the bride's family was accused of deceit. Some girls, to avoid disgrace, resorted to tricks, pricking their fingers, using bags filled with animal blood, or applying herbs that irritated the mucous membranes. These secrets were passed from woman to woman, especially in towns. Male virginity, expectations versus reality. Men were not expected to remain virgins. On the contrary, a young man was supposed to know the flesh before marriage. It was believed that a man needed experience to satisfy his wife and ensure procreation. Visiting brothels was considered part of a boy's education. However, this did not mean complete freedom. The church preached moderation, and open promiscuity could damage one's reputation. In monasteries and religious schools, boys were expected to remain chaste. They were forbidden to masturbate, engage in sexual acts, or even dream about women. Violations were punished with harsh penance, sometimes flogging or exile. Nevertheless, chronicles often mention violations, relationships between novices, liaisons with peasant girls, or night escapes beyond the monastery walls. It was a constant struggle between bodily nature and religious ideal. Attitudes toward the body and nudity. The Middle Ages viewed the naked body as dangerous, inciting sinful desire and temptation. Nudity was associated either with shame, such as during punishment or execution, or with original sin. Even in art, Adam and Eve began to be depicted with fig leaves and later clothed. Female breasts, buttocks, and the pubic area were considered sources of the sin of the gaze and were concealed under several layers of clothing. However, the perception of nudity depended on context. In bathhouses, village rivers, or medical situations, nudity was viewed differently. For instance, physicians examined the entire body, especially when bloodletting, cleansing, or childbirth was involved. Midwives work with naked women daily. Peasant women might bathe nude in rivers during summer if no men were nearby. But generally, even private baths were taken with efforts to remain unseen. In cities, there were specific rules regarding nudity. It was forbidden to appear naked in public, even while fleeing a fire. In Paris, a man caught naked in a public place could be fined or even put in the stocks. Women were instructed to sleep in nightgowns so as not to tempt their husbands even at night. Hygiene and fear of the body. The common belief in a dirty Middle Ages is somewhat exaggerated. In reality, many urban residents strove for cleanliness, but understood it differently. Bodies were washed not for pleasure, but for health and morality. Hygiene was closely tied to medical theories. It was believed that disease entered the body through the pores. Therefore, during epidemics, public baths were closed and hot water was avoided. Doctors recommended dry rub-downs, aromatic oils, changing clothes, and washing hands and faces. Women paid particular attention to intimate hygiene. They used infusions of sage, chamomile, vinegar, or ash. Floral scents and herbal powders were used to eliminate odors. Girls in convents wrote hygiene recipes into medical collections, and midwives passed this knowledge on to young brides. However, frequent bathing of the whole body was condemned by the church. It was seen as indulgent, almost lascivious. Women who lingered in water were especially suspect. They could be accused of witchcraft or wantonness. Menstruation as unclean flow. Menstruation was perceived as a dirty flow. Contraception, abortion, and monastic sexuality in the Middle Ages. Prohibitions, fear, and practice. The Church proclaimed that the sole purpose of sexual activity was procreation, and any interference in this process was considered a mortal sin. Yet reality often clashed with doctrine. People, both lay and monastic, sought to avoid unwanted pregnancies, conceal traces of sexual relations, or mitigate the consequences of sin. This gave rise to a kind of underground world of bodily practices, where herbs, spells, folk healers, and popular beliefs often intersected with medicine, fear, and violence. Folk contraception, a secret shared among women. Officially, the use of any methods to prevent conception was a sin and a crime against God, but women, especially in rural and urban communities, passed down contraceptive knowledge orally, from mother to daughter, from midwives to brides. This was a special language of bodily secrecy, unwritten in books, yet deeply rooted in daily life. The most common contraceptive methods involved herbal infusions. For example, decoctions of rue, tansy, sage, or aloe were consumed before or after intercourse, believed to either cool the womb or induce menstruation. Pieces of wool soaked in vinegar or honey or flower petals were sometimes inserted into the vagina. These methods didn't guarantee protection, but they offered a sense of control. In towns, midwives and elderly vendors often sold infertility potions, disguised as remedies for women's weakness. These could be expensive, but demand was constant. Servants, widows, and women involved with monks or nobles, whose pregnancies could ruin lives, were among the most frequent customers. There were also superstitious practices, tying knots in belts during sex, wearing amulets made from the umbilical cords of stillborn infants, or whispering spells during intimate contact. The Church condemned these methods as witchcraft. Women caught using them were sometimes accused of sorcery, especially if they also used herbs that expelled the fetus. Abortion, a hidden practice. Abortion was strictly forbidden and punished as murder. However, folk methods of miscarriage existed, especially in cases of illegitimate pregnancies or in poor families. Healers used herbs with abortive effects: monkshood, tansy, juniper, wormwood, celandine. These caused intense pain, bleeding, and sometimes death. Mechanical methods were also used: blows to the abdomen, rolling on the ground, jumping from heights, or hot salt baths. These were brutal and dangerous measures employed out of desperation. Some women turned to old midwives, who might insert sharp objects or hot infusions into the womb to induce miscarriage.
If a pregnancy occurred in a convent or among noble maidens, it brought terror to the family. Such cases were hidden. The girl might be sent to a distant village, the child secretly given away, or even killed. In some monasteries, newborns were abandoned at the gates or buried in gardens. These incidents were covered up, but occasionally exposed. Nuns were expelled, abbesses removed, and priests transferred to other dioceses. The Church maintained that life began at conception. However, popular belief sometimes distinguished between an embryo and a person. Some thought the soul entered the fetus only on the 40th day, thus justifying early abortions. Physicians debated. Some argued that the fetus was lifeless until it moved. Others claimed any expulsion was murder. Clerical sexuality, prohibitions, and hidden desires. Celibacy, the vow of chastity, was mandatory for Catholic clergy from the 11th century onward, though encouraged even earlier. Priests were forbidden to marry, keep concubines, or engage in sexual relationships. However, in practice, monks, canons, and even bishops often broke this rule. In some monasteries, abbots had housemaids, who were essentially lovers. In cities, there were homes regularly visited by monks. Village priests often lived with cooks, who performed not just household, but also intimate duties. In some regions, this was seen as a lesser evil. Better to have one steady woman than seduce widows or parishioners. Such arrangements were sometimes tolerated by the local population, especially if the priest was kind, generous, and didn't harshly condemn sins of the flesh. Monasteries housed both heterosexual and homosexual relationships. Male communities were enclosed spaces where bodily urges found expression in secret nightly encounters between novices. These were known, discussed, condemned, but not always eliminated. Chronicles occasionally mention cases of young monks being whipped or reassigned to other monasteries. In other instances, such relationships were viewed as youthful lapses, especially if not violent. Female convents were not free from physical intimacy either. Abbesses tried to regulate close bonds between nuns, sleeping in the same bed, staying alone in cells, holding hands, or hugging without necessity was forbidden. Nevertheless, historians have found letters and notes expressing deep emotional attachment, often with physical overtones. Some scholars interpret these as romantic or even sexual relationships, particularly in isolated female communities. Priests caught committing sexual abuse or debauchery were officially subject to ecclesiastical trial, but in practice they were often simply transferred to another parish to avoid scandal. When public trials did occur, punishments could be severe. Sin, law, and shame. How adultery, rape, and incest were punished in the Middle Ages. Medieval society was deeply permeated by fear of sexual disorder. Sexual life was regulated not only by religion, but also by secular law, customs, and public opinion. Sex outside of marriage, adultery, incest, and rape were all seen as threats to social stability, family lineage, morality, and divine order. Punishments for such offenses could be harsh, public, and humiliating. However, the severity of punishment often depended on gender, social status,
and who was considered the offended party. Adultery, a crime against the husband and a bloodline. In the Middle Ages, female adultery was considered not just a moral transgression, but a crime that undermined the husband's honor and the integrity of the family line. A man had the right to suspect his wife even under vague circumstances. Mere suspicion could lead to isolation, beatings, or public trials. A woman caught in adultery often lost her dowry, property, and custody of her children. In some parts of Europe, such women were publicly humiliated, shaved bald, driven out of the house in their undergarments, or displayed in the town square wearing an iron mask of shame. Male infidelity was formerly considered sinful too, but society punished it far less often, especially if the man was involved with an unmarried woman. However, seducing a married woman or a girl from another household could result in charges of corruption, large fines, or imprisonment. If the lover was of lower status and the woman came from a noble or wealthy family, the offense could lead to execution for insulting the honor of the lineage. In aristocratic circles, adultery could provoke duels. A husband seeking to restore his honor would challenge the lover to a fight, often ending fatally without solid proof. The woman in question was frequently confined to a convent for life, with no chance of return. Rape, a crime against the male owner. Rape was often seen less as violence against a woman and more as an attack on the honor of her family or the property of her father or husband. Victims could be blamed for provocation, especially if they were alone, poor, or dressed suspiciously. Women often had to prove that they resisted by screaming, sustaining injuries, or attempting escape. Without witnesses or signs of struggle, their testimony carried little weight. In rural areas, punishment depended on the community's reaction. Sometimes the rapist had to pay a fine to the victim's father or husband. In rare cases, especially if the victim was of noble birth, the rapist was publicly whipped, castrated, or hanged. Poor women were often left without justice. If the woman was unmarried, she could be forced to marry. Public punishments were humiliating. Rapists might be tied to a shame pole, dressed in women's clothing, or marked with obscene symbols. In large cities like Paris or London, sex offenders could be tarred, feathered, and paraded through the streets amid mockery. Incest, fear of cursed offspring. Incest, sexual relations between close relatives, was met with particular horror. The Church forbade any marriage or sexual relationship up to the 7th degree of kinship. Even third cousins could be denied church weddings. Yet among the nobility, such marriages occurred to preserve landholdings, requiring papal dispensation. Incest outside marriage, especially between a father and daughter, siblings, or mother and son, incurred the harshest penalties. Chronicles record cases where fathers caught committing incest were burned alive or hanged after torture. Women were sometimes treated as victims, but could still be punished by exile, forced monastic life, or public shame. Occasionally, both parties were executed. The situation was more complex among peasants, where kinship ties were not always clearly known. Priests recorded genealogies to prevent incestuous marriages. However, due to a shortage of women or widowing, secret relationships among cousins still occurred. Public shame, the body as a symbol of disgrace. Shame punishments were a powerful tool of control. The criminal's body became a spectacle of ridicule and condemnation. Women caught in adultery or prostitution might be paraded with a sign reading "whore," forced to walk barefoot on cobblestones, or carry heavy stones above their heads. Some were branded on the face with a cross or the letter A for adulterium, adultery. Men accused of debauchery could be locked in wooden cages in the town square, where people threw rotten eggs or garbage at them. Public nudity, especially of private parts, was used to mock them. Men convicted of homosexuality could be forced to wear women's clothes, display their buttocks, or be shaved, the beard being a symbol of manly honor. The harshest punishment was exile, loss of community, shelter, and protection. Exiles could not visit markets, attend church, or participate in village life. Women accused of repeated sexual misconduct were especially likely to be expelled and labeled as spoiled. Extrajudicial punishment, vigilante and family justice. Not all punishments came from legal authorities. Sometimes families took justice into their own hands. Brothers might kill their sister's lover. Fathers might stab daughters who brought shame, and husbands might beat wives they suspected of adultery. These acts were seen as restoring order and often went unpunished. Communities also acted. Villagers might beat a rapist, expel a seducer. Flesh for sale. Prostitution in medieval Europe. Prostitution in the Middle Ages was widespread, from densely populated cities to small ports and villages. Despite strict morality and religious prohibitions, medieval society had an ambivalent attitude toward prostitution. On one hand, the Church regarded it as a sin. On the other, as a necessary evil that helped restrain male lust and preserve the chastity of virtuous women. Urban prostitution and public order. In major medieval cities, Paris, London, Prague, Augsburg, Venice, prostitution was legalized and regulated by municipal authorities. Officials saw brothels as a means of reducing rape, adultery, and chaotic street passion. In return, they demanded taxes, records, and adherence to established rules. Prostitutes were confined to specific quarters. For example, in 13th century Paris, there was the Rue Gravois, a street inhabited only by women of easy virtue. Venice had several such districts, including Campo del Gatto, where prostitution operated under official protection. In London, brothels were concentrated in Southwark, across the Thames, ironically under the jurisdiction of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who received income from them. Rules of life and labor. Work in brothels followed strict regulations. Women were forbidden from going out after certain hours. They were required to wear special clothing, often red, to make them easily recognizable. Sometimes they were banned from wearing jewelry, furs, or elaborate hairstyles to avoid being confused with respectable townsfolk. Prostitutes were subject to regular medical inspections, not for their own health, but to control the spread of disease among clients. If a physician found signs of venereal disease, the woman would be sent to a house of repentance or temporarily banished. Most women began working in brothels during adolescence. Many were orphans, widows, runaways, or poor girls who turned to prostitution as a last resort. Brothel owners profited from them by providing lodging, protection, and a stream of clients. But the women's share of the profit was minimal. Much went to food, clothing, taxes, and upkeep. Private and seasonal prostitution. In addition to official brothels, there was street prostitution. Women might offer themselves at markets, alleys, or taverns. This form was riskier. Women were often beaten, robbed, or arrested. However, they had some freedom. They didn't depend on an owner, kept all their earnings, and could change locations at will. During holidays, fairs, protests, reforms, and persecutions. From time to time, moralist waves swept through Europe. In the 14th and 15th centuries, especially after the plague, attitudes toward the body grew more severe. Prostitutes were expelled from cities, brothels burned, and women flogged in public squares. In cities like Florence under Savonarola, brothels were entirely closed, and former workers left destitute. The Reformation in Germany and Switzerland imposed even stricter standards. Prostitution was equated with moral decay, and women suspected of lewd behavior could be punished without trial. But complete eradication proved impossible. In the 17th century, despite official bans in several countries, prostitution persisted, now often in clandestine forms. Women hosted clients in their homes, posing as laundresses, fortune-tellers, or widows. Cities turned a blind eye as long as public order wasn't disturbed. The fate of women between survival and contempt. Life for a prostitute in the Middle Ages rarely ended well. Youth faded quickly. The work, abuse, illness, and fatigue left deep marks. Those who managed to save money sometimes opened their own brothel or tavern. A few married, usually to soldiers, widowers, or artisans with tarnished reputations. Most ended their lives in poverty, in shelters, hospitals, or monasteries that accepted them under strict vows to renounce their past. Their bodies were buried on the outskirts of town, without names or crosses. Society forgot them the moment they died. And yet, despite the contempt and threats, they remained part of the urban landscape, hidden, necessary, despised, but never completely banished.